back to the Daily Grind. Thanks for checking out the channel. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back pickle biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
And this is a recap of UFC 3, The American Dream. Now first off, I gotta give a shout out to Aaron Burrell, who requested the first video. He said I should do a recap on UFC 1. I should watch UFC 1, give my thoughts on it, and then also give my thoughts on what mixed martial arts is as a sport and like where it came from and to where it is now. I did that in the past, and then I was like, yo, I really enjoyed UFC 1, and since I hadn't watched all of them in a row, I've seen like maybe 1 here, 5 there, 8 there, but I've never watched them in a row. So I was like, hey, I might as well, since we've got our channel now. I went back and watched UFC 2. Now this is UFC 3. So I watched UFC 3. Here it's a tournament style like the first 2. There were 8 fighters in this tournament, and I believe there were 16 fighters in either the first or second UFC, but they've limited it down to 8 fighters. But still, there's no rules, no time limits, and no way out. Now this one is called, it doesn't even really say UFC 3. It says the UFC The American Dream, but it's still UFC 3. Royce Gracie returned, Ken Shamrock returned, the sumo wrestler returned from, I forget his name, Emmanuel Yarborough. He returned. He was in the first UFC, so I believe he might have been in the second as well. So we'll get straight into this recap of UFC 3, The American Dream. Now, keep in mind, Royce Gracie won the first 2 tournaments, UFC tournament, UFC 1 and UFC 2. Royce Gracie's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu won the entire tournament, and this is no size limits, no weight, there's no weight limits, nothing. You can bring, you can wear shoes if you want, and that's where there is a little bit of rules. They advertise that there's no rules, but if you wear shoes, you can't kick, stuff like that. So, but there's really essentially no rules in this. So with that being said, Jim Brown and Ben Perry were commentating for UFC 3. Jim Brown is an NFL Hall of Famer and legend, and he's commentating for the first 3 UFCs. That's pretty interesting. I don't know why this stands out. NFL player, and he's actually pretty knowledgeable about the sport, and to be here from the inception of the UFC, that's pretty cool to me. So with that being said, Jim Brown is going to be commentating alongside another guy that's been commentating with him, and then also Ben Perry. So with that being said, coming into the fights, before the first fight got started, they advertised the tournament as like, there's 2 broad categories of fighters, like punchers and grapplers, and now we clearly know that it's a lot more broad than that. It's a lot. There's kickboxing, it's a lot more than just punchers versus grapplers. But what that made me think of is, think about back in the day, like boxing was definitely established and this was a brand new sport. So if you've got your grapplers, your Royce Gracies and Ken Shamrocks of the world dominating these fights, and it's like grapplers versus punchers, it just seems like, boxers would definitely fall into punching. So if you're a casual fan coming in, I don't know, it just seemed like a pretty good marketing strategy from the UFC to like label all strikers as punchers versus grapplers, even though once you got into the fights, they didn't just say, all right, this guy's a puncher. So I don't know, that's just a side note that I found interesting coming into UFC 3. They called some guys punchers and some guys grapplers. So with that being said, some of the returning people, as I said, were Ken Shamrock, Royce Gracie. Both of them, Royce Gracie was in the first 2 UFCs. Ken Shamrock, I believe, had a broken wrist, he said, or they said he had an injury preventing him from coming back to UFC 2, but he was back at UFC 3. And then, of course, the 600-pound, 6'8" sumo wrestler, Emmanuel Yarborough. He was a black sumo wrestler from New Jersey. He was back, and he was going to be fighting in the first fight of the night. And he did fight in the first fight of the night, so we'll jump straight into that. It was the sumo wrestler, 600-pound Emmanuel Yarborough versus Keith Hackney, a 200-pound karate kung fu fighter. Now, this was clearly, he had 400 pounds of size. He was taller than Keith. It was like fucking David versus a Goliath. So, starting off the fight, Keith Hackney looked like he might have been taking a little bit of note from Royce Gracie, as a lot of people clearly had been, because he started off the fight with some oblique kicks to kind of keep the big beast back. You know what I'm saying? Big ass sumo wrestler. He started off with some oblique kicks, and then he landed a big ass overhand right palm strike, bro, and it dropped the sumo wrestler. He lost his balance, as you could expect from a big ass 600 pounder. He lost his balance, and so Lil Hackney, I called him Lil Hackney because he's so much smaller, but Keith Hackney ran up to the sumo wrestler while he was down and started to try and give him a little bit of ground and pound while he was on his knees. but the big ass blob dude was still so big, he just grabbed him, you know what I'm saying, and started to pound on his ass, because he was, even though he was on his knees, he was still about as tall as Keith Hackney. So he grabbed Keith Hackney from his knees, and they started to fight while the sumo wrestler was on his knees. He wrapped up Keith Hackney. They ended up getting the fight broken up. They got back to their feet, and not broken up by the ref. You know, they just got out of the position because the ref wasn't standing you up. No, you know, it wasn't. The ref was only there to stop the fight at the end. So they got back to their feet. The sumo wrestler used the cage, and he also leaned against Keith Hackney on the cage, and they fell through the cage because he was so much fucking weight on the cage when they stood up. So the ref got him back in the cage. They were on their feet, and not long after that, Keith Hackney dropped he dropped the big fat dude again, 600-pound sumo wrestler. He dropped him again and finished the fight because he couldn't stand up. He was like face down. The sumo wrestler was face down, just getting the ground and pounded, and he ended up tapping the strikes. He couldn't get up. So Keith Hackney, the karate guy, won the fight, but he looked like he might have broke his hand on Yarborough's head, the sumo wrestler's head, with the final ground and pound before the ref stopped the fight. He was landing some pretty big shots for about 30 seconds before the guy got out of there. So come to find out, he actually did break his hand, and he wasn't able to come back for the next fight. But they did have alternates on the side of these tournaments just in case somebody won the fight but wasn't able to make it. They had alternates on standby. Now this is very interesting. You'll see later on what happens with the alternates. This was actually very interesting. I thought Royce Gracie won this tournament, and he still might. Oops, spoiler alert. Royce Gracie, I'll tell you this much since I already said that, and I'm not restarting. Royce Gracie does not lose to anybody in this tournament. It's very interesting what happens in this tournament. So we'll keep going to the next fight. The karate fighter beat the sumo wrestler in the first fight of the night. Karate fighter moves on. Now, Ken Shamrock, who was also a fan favorite, made it to the finals of the first UFC. He was back for UFC 3. He was a shoot fighter, and he was going to be fighting Christoph Lineker, a judo black belt on the Olympic team, the U.S. Olympic team. So judo versus shoot fighting. And Ken Shamrock, of course, was a fan favorite. A lot of people wanted to see him versus Royce in the finals again and thought he might have a good chance. Ken Shamrock was one of the most popular fighters coming into the arena, and the crowd happened to be on his side. But what happened in the fight was Ken Shamrock looked like he knew about steroids before everybody else, because he looked like a fucking Greek god, ripped, perfect, muscle magazine Ken Shamrock. And a lot of his opponents just looked like they were athletic and healthy, but they weren't fucking perfect like Ken Shamrock. So Ken Shamrock just looked like, his opponent was wearing a gi, so Ken Shamrock not only looked like that, but they started fighting, and Ken Shamrock started landing some big punches in the beginning, but the fight got taken down like almost immediately, and Ken Shamrock started, he was in the judo guy's guard. So the judo guy was on his back, and Ken Shamrock was in his guard, and the judo guy was landing big shots from his back. He was landing big shots on Ken Shamrock, which made Ken Shamrock and him actually end up having to scramble, because even though Ken Shamrock was in top position, he was like losing the fight. Like, oh shit, I didn't really expect all of these strikes from the ground. You know, he was wanting to work for a submission. But the fight, they ended up standing back up, and they ended up right back on the floor. So how the fight stood up was, the judo player went for like an arm bar, which gave Ken Shamrock enough space to stand back up, but the fight immediately went right back to the floor, and Ken Shamrock was right back in the judo player's guard, and this time though he was able to land some big ground and pound, and the fight was over very quickly after that. So Ken Shamrock advanced to the semifinals. It was going to be Ken Shamrock versus the karate player who fought the sumo wrestler, but he was out. So we're going to have Ken Shamrock versus an alternate. Ken Shamrock looked good in the fight, and he took some shots to the head while he was in Christoph Lineker's guard, but he still didn't look like he was injured after the fight. Ken Shamrock looked like he was looking good. So with that being said, we move to the next fight. We have our semifinal set. That wasn't the finals, but whoever wins out of Ken Shamrock and the alternate will move to the finals in the next fight. So next we had Roland Payne versus Harold Howard. Motherfucking karate. The dude looked like a heavyweight blonde Joe Dirt, bro. But this was literally my favorite fighter of the tournament, Harold Howard, and he had a really good chance of winning. Harold Howard He was like a heavyweight in size, but he was the most well-rounded fighter in the tournament because he was a karate guy that also started to learn jiu-jitsu, started to practice jiu-jitsu. But he also was really big, so his wrestling was on point. He was able to defend takedowns. So Harold Howard really threw a monkey wrench into this tournament, and you'll see why. In his first fight, he was fighting Roland Payne, who was a Muay Thai kickboxer. So it was a well-rounded MMA fighter versus a Muay Thai kickboxer. But Harold Howard, even though he was very well-rounded, he was more known for his karate and his jiu-jitsu. So Harold Howard looked amazing in this first fight of the night. He looked like a savage, came out, landed big shots, and he showed his takedown defense. His opponent went for a takedown, and he secured a fucking DDT. Literally a fucking DDT, landed on his opponent's head and flipped backwards. So they got right back to their feet. And the heavyweight blonde Joe Dirt, man, I'm telling you, he might have been one of the most well-rounded fighters coming into this tournament we had seen to date. But he ended up on his back after an exchange. The Muay Thai fighter got side control, but he didn't do any damage. The jiu-jitsu karate guy was able to use like an elbow escape, get right back up, and end up knocking out Roland Payne pretty quick. So Harold Howard came in looking like a heavyweight blonde Joe Dirt, but he was also looked like the best fighter in the tournament. And with his size, he wasn't injured. Got through the first round pretty easily. So it was going to be him versus the winner of Royce Gracie and whoever Royce Gracie is about to fight. So with that being said, we've got 3 semifinalists left. All we've got next is to find out who's left out of Royce Gracie and Chemo. Now Chemo is the motherfucking Yoel Romero of UFC 3. He was the Jesus Soldier, came in looking like one of the dudes that on Game of Thrones that mess with Khaleesi, the Khalasar, the niggas with the ponytails, motherfucking God of War and shit. That's what he came in looking like, but he was hella jacked, hella big, came in, when he walked out, he had a fucking cross on his back, he had the Jesus Thug Life tattoo. You know where Tupac had Thug Life? This nigga had Jesus, bro. Chemo was not fucking around, and he was fighting Royce Gracie in the first round. Royce Gracie was not getting no easy road. So check this out. If Royce Gracie beats this guy, then he's got to go fight the big heavyweight Joe Dirt motherfucker. Woo! And then if he wins that, he's got to fight Ken Shamrock, who looks like he knew about steroids before steroids. This nigga motherfucking Royce Gracie had a hard road for UFC 3. But this Chemo dude, he was going to have a hard road with just Chemo, big soldier, a god-ass dude. But they ran straight at each other. Chemo and Royce Gracie actually got Chemo against the fence, and they went through the fence again. The fence came undone, the door opened. Once they got back in, the fighters were clinched, and Royce was using a combination. Again, you know, they were clinched against the fence for quite a while. Royce Gracie was using a combination. He ended up using a combination of knees and trips to take Chemo down. Chemo ended up on Royce Gracie's back, though, after, you know, Royce tried to trip him, but they were against the fence and Chemo's so big, so he ended up on Royce Gracie's back. But after some serious scrambling, Royce got to guard position, and he had to dodge some heavy bombs from the much bigger Soldier of God, big Chemo on top of him. So Royce Gracie got a hold of Chemo's ponytail. You know, he had like a ponytail sticking out, just like a, I don't even know what they're all, like a God of War. I can't even think of the fucking, you know exactly what I'm talking about, bro. Like them warrior dudes on Game of Thrones, that the ones that fucking raped Khaleesi, bro, but they ended up turning her to the queen and shit like that. And you know, the king, shit's crazy. He looked like a Samoan warrior, but he had a ponytail up top. So Royce Gracie was in it, had him in his guard, and he was holding on to his ponytail. So Royce Gracie was holding on to his ponytail and fucking landing his own ground and pound off of his back. Royce Gracie ended up busting Chemo's face, but before anything happened, before Royce Gracie was able to find a submission, Chemo landed a overhand bomb on motherfucking Royce Gracie's face or his shoulder, but he was so much bigger than Royce, it did damage. Landed one. Royce eventually then got out and got Chemo in an arm bar and shit. So Royce tapped him out, but Royce took a lot of damage from Chemo, and he finished him with an arm bar, but that was a hell of a fight. super fun fight. But now we've got the last 4 fighters in the tournament. So Royce Gracie beat the big soldier god, way heavier than him, with an armbar. But now he's going to have to fight heavyweight Joe Dirt, who's looking like the most well-rounded fighter, who's even got some jiu-jitsu skills and striking skills. So that's who Royce Gracie will be fighting next. But first, we have Ken Shamrock versus an alternate, because Keith Hackney, who beat the big sumo, he got injured, we find out. So Ken Shamrock has to fight an alternate. Ken Shamrock comes in, he ends up beating the alternate. Let me see, did I record on that? Yeah, the alternate's name was Felix Lee Mitchell. It was a black dude. He was an alternate. He was a kickboxer. And so it was Felix Lee Mitchell versus this dude, this alternate guy. Ken Shamrock comes in, immediately grabs the alternate, wanting, his name was Mitchell, so I'll call him Mitchell. Ken Shamrock immediately grabbed Mitchell, wanting to get the fight on the mat, but they ended up clinched against the cage, with Mitchell holding on to the cage for dear life. It must not have been illegal at that point, because Mitchell had both hands clenched in the cage so he wouldn't get taken down, holding on for dear life. Big John McCarthy, I gotta bring up though, he was the referee for the entire tournament. That's crazy how long he's been around. But he refereed the entire UFC 3, every single round, Big John McCarthy. So, but the alternate was holding on to the cage for dear life. And he had both hands locked in the fence. Ken Shamrock ended up taking his back against the fence though, and started working for a takedown, started working for submissions against the fence, but he was unable to get it, so they stayed clinched for about 3 minutes, holding on to the fence and holding on to each other's pants, until Ken Shamrock eventually was able to get the takedown. He took Mitchell's back and submitted him, so Ken Shamrock moved to the finals, and he looked pretty healthy. He definitely didn't look injured, didn't look like he got injured in that fight. Now, that's definitely gonna, matter, so keep that in mind. Ken Shamrock did not look injured, got the victory, moving on to the finals versus either Royce Gracie or the big motherfucking Joe Dirt heavyweight beast. This dude was a savage. He was my favorite fighter of this tournament, the Joe Dirt dude. So now we've got Royce Gracie, who's supposed to be fighting Harold Howard. That's the Joe Dirt guy, but I'm gonna start calling him Harold Howard. So Harold Howard comes into the fight. Royce Gracie versus Harold Howard. Royce comes in, walks into the fight. He's got a cut under his eye from the first fight, and a lot of people thought Royce Gracie was injured after the first round. Like, man, he took some damage when he was walking out. He was limping, so he came in with the cut under his eye and blood on his gi, and he was fighting a straight savage, in Harold Howard, and who was looking fresh. Harold Howard didn't look like he had any injuries. He was the bigger fighter, so it was just looking bad for Royce Gracie. And I was thinking to myself, if Royce beats this Harold Howard guy right now, he is the greatest fucking fighter of all time. But what happened is, right before the fight was about to start, Royce Gracie's team threw in the towel and said that he can't fight due to a shoulder injury in the first fight, which pissed Harold off. He stormed out of the cage, and Chemo, Royce Gracie's first opponent, stormed back in the cage to take credit for dethroning Royce, even though he got submitted by Royce Gracie. But everybody, it seemed like, wanted to beat Royce Gracie, which was interesting. Harold was pissed off he didn't get to fight Royce Gracie because Royce Gracie was injured, so he walked to the cage, which was, I don't know, there was some political shit going on here. Chemo came out, who already lost and got tapped out, like, I'm the one that beat Royce Gracie. Harold, who was about to fight Royce, was pissed off because he didn't get to beat Royce Gracie. And then Ken Shamrock, who had already made it to the finals, after he found out Royce Gracie pulled out, he said, you know what, I'm injured too. I'm not even fighting the finals. The alternate can take my spot. Everybody wanted to be the guy to beat Royce Gracie, the former winner of the first 2 UFCs. And then the way that Royce Gracie's team played it, I don't really understand, because, I mean, I'm sure I could understand it if I really thought about it, but what they did was they made the walk and waited till the fight started, right at the very beginning, and then threw in the towel before a strike was thrown. I don't know why they wouldn't just not make the walk and say, sorry, we got injured. We won, but we got injured, so the alternate takes our place. Because now it's like the alternate doesn't get to fight Harold Howard. You know what I'm saying? Because Royce Gracie made the walk. So that was really weird how that played out. But what ended up happening was Ken Shamrock found out, and he said he's out. So the finals ended up being alternate versus Harold Howard. Harold Howard I thought Harold Howard was going to win. That's the big beastie Joe Dirt looking savage, well-rounded mixed martial artist. and he was fighting another alternate whose name was, and I've got this for you guys. I didn't want to spoil it at the very beginning, so give me 1 second. Here it is. This is the alternate. Now this was the Joe Dirt looking guy right here, who I thought was going to win the whole thing, and Steve Jenham was the alternate. Now Harold looked good, came in the fight, had the best. I thought he was about to win. They stood back up. Even though Harold did a lot of damage in the fight, Steve Jenham got him down. And after Steve Jenham got Harold to the ground with a trip and a takedown, he mounted him, and Harold couldn't get out of his mount, and his corner threw in the towel right as the referee stopped the fight. And I think he might have started to tap too. So Steve Jenham, and a brand new alternate, first fight was the finals, won the tournament because Ken Shamrock pulled out. It should have been Ken Shamrock versus Harold Howard, and that would have been a great fight. But Ken Shamrock said, since Hoist ain't fighting, fuck it, I got injured, I'm not fighting either. So the alternate stepped in and won the whole tournament. So the end was crazy. I did not expect that. Hoist Gracie, nobody really beat, because he won a fight and then got injured in the fight, so he was unable to continue. And a lot of people, every single person that wanted to beat Hoist was pissed. Chemo came in like, I'm the one that injured Hoist, woohoo, even though he got submitted. And then the big Joe Dirt guy right here was pissed off. So with that being said, that's the recap of UFC 3, man. It was super fun. You can watch it on UFC Fight Pass. That was just me and what I took from it. So if you enjoyed this video, if you watched it, I definitely appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Let the full-time family know what you think in the comments. I'm out. That shit was fun, I'm telling you.
Da 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 da. It's the motherfucking DOWG.